In the manifesto now posted to the website for the Obey campaign, Ferry has this to say, I quote at length. The Obey sticker attempts to stimulate curiosity and bring people to question both the sticker and their relationship with their surroundings, because people are not used to seeing advertisements or propaganda for which the product or motive is not obvious. Frequent and novel encounters with the sticker provoke thought and possible frustration, nevertheless revitalizing the viewer's perception and attention to detail. The sticker has no meaning, but exists only to cause people to react, to contemplate and search for meaning in the sticker. Because Obey has no actual meaning, the various reactions and interpretations of those who view it reflect their personality and the nature of their sensibilities. End quote. Clearly, to insist that a piece of street art is meaningless is a meaningful message in itself. But if the artist placing stenciled soldiers in strategic locations around Willie Street has the same attitude as Ferry, then my attempts to assess another's personhood through these soldiers has been focused in entirely the wrong direction. Like Ferry's audience, I may very well be interpreting a reflection of my own personhood. Ultimately, Tigua-style painting is no different. Tourists, promoters, and a variety of scholars have all tended to view Tigua-style art as illustrative of rural indigenous life in the Ecuadorian Andes. Nor is this perception entirely mistaken, but there are many elements of contemporary indigenous life that one simply does not see in most paintings. For example, this one, there are no machines, there are no modern modes of transportation or any signs of them. Nobody's wearing jeans or a t-shirt here. A practiced eye will note that there are actually quite a few signs of non-indigenous influence on indigenous life. The cinder block house here is one of those aspects. That family is pretty wealthy, and it's, I think, no mistake that the economic symbols of Cotopaxi appear in front of that house instead of some other house. In part, this is a result of the need to conform to consumers' expectations in order to make a sale. As Blanca Muratorio writes, quote, like Gucci and Calvin Klein, both consecrated masters of the market, the indigenous people of the Sierra have mastered the subtleties of the competitive scene and fully understand that they should wear typical clothing and assume appropriate bodily attitudes if they want to legitimize, authenticate, and increase their sales. Tigua painters produce their artworks in that same spirit. But Muratoyo goes on to point out that the mere existence of this genre, from which non-indigenous items have been eliminated, is a challenge to the dominant white mestizo society. Rudy Coyorelo-Mansfeld showed quite clearly in a recent article how the codes according to which artists working in the Tigua style create their art are not necessarily the same codes according to which tourists or anthropologists have generally interpreted them. The need to make sales places a great deal of power in the hands of consumers to dictate what the paintings look like and which messages seem to be conveyed. But like street artists in Madison, Tigua painters can challenge that power by creating some messages that their audiences are simply not in a position to understand. The political potential of Tigua paintings is realized most overtly in works that illustrate events from Ecuador's famously successful indigenous movement. These paintings are uncommon in tourist market stalls, but there are quite a few of them floating around. Unlike the pastoral scenes most popular among tourists, explicitly political paintings often portray specific events and individual people. And here we have a 2002 painting by Fausto Toaquisa, a perspective on the ouster of President Jamil Mawad 2 years earlier in 2000. Mawad can be seen at the center of the painting, fleeing the presidential residence with two subordinates, one of whom is carrying a suitcase full of dollars, symbolizing one of the reasons that Mawad was actually kicked out, which is that he wanted to dollarize the economy. That happened after he left anyway, but there's a sign of it here. The short-lived Junta de Salvación Nacional faces the gathering crowd from the balcony of the Palacio. Lucio Gutierrez holds the microphone. At the time, he was an army colonel. He He was jailed for 6 months after the coup, was elected president right around the time that Toquisa produced this painting, and then was later removed from office by an act of the Ecuadorian Congress in response to another wave of mass protests. Gutierrez clasps the hand of Antonio Vargas, raising it high in triumph. Vargas was then president of the Confederación de Nacionalidades Indígenas del Ecuador, CONAIE. To the other side of Gutierrez is the third member of the junta, Carlos Solórzano, then president of Ecuador's Supreme Court. With closer scrutiny, other individuals might also be identifiable. For example, the woman here looks like she might be Nina Pacari, another prominent indigenous politician. And I would imagine that some of these other people are identifiable as well. I don't recognize them, but I think somebody might. That the scene is an indigenous political, that this is a scene of indigenous political empowerment is unquestionable. I think that's clear. Contingents have arrived from all over Ecuador to participate in the protest together. Their many-colored CONAIE flags and slogan-inscribed signs emphasize coordinated action. But there are also many hidden expressions of indigenous power. The Amazonian and coastal shamans, here and here, as well as the historic or pre-colonial leader in the clouds above, are all directing their energy to Vargas, not to Gutierrez, not to the future president, but to the indigenous leader. And on top of all of this, the presidential palace and the National Bank have been transported from the center of Quito, the site of non-indigenous power, to the indigenous countryside. There are all sorts of folkloric things going on around, too. There are stories. This is a cycle of folkloric stories here that's being presented, as are some of the other things going on in the background. Antigua-style painting, like other forms of tourism-oriented arts and crafts, calls for a creative approach to the anthropology of art. To explain the artist's goals or their aesthetic codes is insufficient, because the meaning that they encode in their work is not necessarily the meaning that their audiences get out of the paintings. Nor can this challenge be addressed by simply comparing the divergent modes of interpretation, because they're both very real at the same time. Both are right. They're both getting something meaningful out of it. The meaningfulness of the art must be taken into account, but this must be done in conjunction with an investigation of how that meaning mediates power-laden and historically contingent relationships between different groups of people. I follow the lead of Arjun Padarai in his introduction to the influential volume, The Social Life of Things. Arjun Padarai famously writes, even though from a theoretical point of view, human actors encode things with significance, from a methodological point of view, it is things in motion that illuminate their human and social context. In this case, the things in motion are artworks. The ultimate goal is still anthropological, to understand something about people in the ways that they interact with each other, think about each other, and stand in relation to each other. But my methodological approach is to seek insight into these issues through an investigation centered around the things that mediate those relationships. So by way of conclusion, and to establish a more explicit connection to the theme of our conference today, I'd like to conclude with a few remarks highlighting the dynamic and mobile nature of the art about which I've spoken here. It's hard to imagine anything more mobile than tourist souvenirs. Many travel long distances just to reach the market in the first place. From there, once they've switched hands, they become even more mobile, crisscrossing the globe with their owners. In the process of that movement, they come to stand for very different ideas. Perhaps they are seen primarily as a source of income by the producers, but they establish memories and relationships as they change hands and come to mean very different things to their new owners. I think something quite similar could be said about graffiti. I muse sometimes about the origin and destination of the graffiti I see painted on train cars, but even the image of Doctor Who stenciled on the sidewalk outside my home, literally immobile, has flowed across conceptual boundaries that are ultimately quite similar to those across which tourist souvenirs move. I don't know what the artist thought as he or she inscribed the neighborhood with Tom Baker's face, But as I walk past it each morning, I deepen my relationship with that unknown person through my own meanings that I read into the image. Thus, I find art moving, both emotionally and anthropologically. Thank you.
Well, we have about 15, 20 minutes for some questions, discussion points. If you would like to get up there, or we can put another chair here. And then it's important to get all the questions out. We might not have sufficient time to get them all answered. However, there will be a reception after the conference where further discussion can take place during lunch, etc. No. Thank you.
So I enjoyed all the presentations. I would like to make questions to all of you, but because of the time, I will only ask Joe some things because I have a similar topic. I was kind of concerned about the idea of looking at art as an extension of the individuals that create such art. It's like this idea of art being a reflection of these people. Representational systems are not necessarily reflections, right? They're constructions. And even Stuart Hall says that language is not a mirror for the people, right? So I was thinking that, sorry, yeah, social processes shape out art processes, and art reconstruct social processes as well, but they also add desires, intentions, and personal motivations within the work of art. And I was actually thinking about the opposite side. What if these guys are not really being honest, if we can say about it, with the representations, and they're rather trying to picture or portray a specific way of the landscapes or the society? Because you say there are no genes and there is no modern objects, so how can we tell this is actually reflecting reality? And well, the Baudrillard's concept of simulacrum, right? I represent something to you that you might imagine I am related to. So we both think that we're acting out reality, but it's hyper-reality, right? It's not fiction, but it's like an acting out of reality. And we are talking about tourist art, but that was like a question. Like, do you think they are artists or artisans, or is there any difference between artists and artisans in your research?
I prefer not to draw a difference between artist and artisan, particularly because of this specific genre. It circulates in the same ways that artisan goods do. You know, carved masks and bracelets and other things that people make. And yet this is very clearly representational in a way that, you know, bracelets or whatever are not. The striped pants you see in the markets everywhere. Those are not representational, and this is. But it's circulating in the same way. So I think the genre itself is a challenge to the idea that there really is anything different about it. To me, in both cases, what we're dealing with is creativity. And these are not honest in the sense that they portray reality. That's really clear. People do tend to treat them that way, though. You know, the artists, the tourists, all kind of seem to think that they are, because that's what they're after. They want authenticity. You know, they want reality, and they want to be able to show it. So I think that misunderstanding is kind of the key here. Everybody has intentions, emotions, motivations with regard to these things. These things happen to be paintings, but we could apply this to other sorts of goods, and especially artistic goods as well. Everybody's got motivations or orientations toward the art, and it seems to be in large part through that they understand the person on the other side. The artists understand the tourists through this. This is why they don't show, you know, literal reality. the tourists understand the artists through this, it's why they think it is reality. And so that's what I'm trying to follow up on here. I haven't actually had enough time to spend with the artists themselves or in the tourist markets to elaborate on the details of that. But hopefully that's what happens next.
I kind of have a follow-up to this question. I mean, did it occur to you to look at the consumerism as a mirror to this instead of focusing on the artist who might be an artisan, as it was pointed out, you look at the reception and who the tourist who goes there is?
Yeah.
Because it's, I mean, it's Ecuador, it's how the question is how the country has been promoted. And even you, you are an educated tourist, an anthropologist who goes there, and even you cannot, and even for the purpose of this conference, did not decipher who these representational personajes on the screen were. So, who do you think the tourist who buys this art is?
Well, it's hard to know. There's been an awful lot of study on one side or the other. You know, the impact of tourism on the community, the impact of tourist experiences on the tourists, but not very much has been said about the way that those experiences flow together. And because those experiences seem to be mediated by these objects, I think it's important to actually follow the objects themselves. That's going to be, I think, fantastically hard, especially to follow them, follow the objects home to wherever the tourists are from. And I haven't worked out how to do that yet. But that's the idea behind the quote I read from A Potter Ride, that there isn't any inherent meaning in any of this stuff. People put that meaning in there. But because they do it, we can use those objects as a way to talk about both sets of people. So that's my goal, or my objective for studying the crafts themselves, rather than studying specifically this group of people or that group of people. I want to follow the crafts through those interactions.
Create a passion between souvenir and memorabilia.
Yeah. Maybe memory more than memorabilia, but as a social connection.
I just echo the comment that the three presentations were excellent. But just a quick question for Ian, and I know you mentioned that tourism was like a mixed bag with that. But are you saying that in the case of Jerry, is there like a promise that this could be more of the benefit of the revenue with the local people than other?
I mean, there is, I've read maybe 3 or 4 other case studies of communities that have been affected by tourism, and in some it's just a disaster, totally uncontrolled development, so there's environmental degradation, exploitation, and it just, people come in, tourism is there for like 10 years, and then the community is ruined, and then nobody's intrigued by the community more so. But Jerry's an interesting case because there was a community council founded in the early 90s. It's inside a national park, and so there's a lot of rules that go along with that. And so I don't know that anybody was ever promised, modernization. It just was kind of a process that started happening, and people just went along with it. So I don't know what it. I mean, where I was at, last summer was just a snapshot, and it's continually evolving. So, I don't know what it looked like in 5 years exactly, but there's been like some controlled local development there. I have to say that the people I talk to feel strong about the way that the community has been able to dictate. Like for example, when they put in power lines in 1998, The community didn't want above ground lines because they thought that would make it look like a city and make it look ugly, so they managed to get these underground lines. There's city codes against building structures more than 2 stories high because they also thought that would look ugly, and saw this whole thing to try to maintain the aesthetic integrity of the town, and their ability to do that was because of the community council.
I have 2 related questions. So for Joe, related to the comment about the people who buy the art, I know a lot of these areas in Ecuador are visited by people who are looking for ecotourism experiences. So I don't know, when I see these kinds of paintings, it kind of brings this pastoral image of Ecuador that is kind of in contrast to the urban centers, but there's this idea of Ecuador being very beautiful and rural and undeveloped from the outside, and I was wondering to what extent kind of the people who are buying these might perpetuate that image. And I mean, again, it may not be the focus of your research.
Yeah, I think they do perpetuate these images, and I think they do it on purpose. It's what the tourists want, and so it's what they get in a lot of ways. And on the business side of things, there's no particular reason to challenge that if the money's flowing in. But there are these sort of insurgent underlying pushes to maybe change the idea just a little bit, take a little bit of power away from other people dictating life, and just sort of explore the boundaries. The people who produce things like this painting are the successful, and sometimes quite successful painters who have more freedom to explore some of those ideas a little bit more. You see protests against Texaco or things through the paintings themselves. So it seems to depend a little bit on the money. If you can afford to do it, you do it. And if you can't afford to do it, you just make a little.
Just on a related note, quickly, is there much ecotourism in this part of Sayara? Or is that, you said mostly it's domestic tourism, so I feel like international tourism brings ecotourism.
Yeah, it's, do you count like windsurfing and stuff as ecotourism? No.
I don't know.
It's really windy there. It's really windy
really-
there, and so they call it sports tourism.
Yeah.
So that's a big draw there. But outside of, in that area, the buggy tours are the big thing. I guess that's sort of ecotourism. They're spewing out all their exhaust and stuff in the protected area. So.
Yeah, it's a kind of controversial certainly.
Yeah, no, but they've been conscious of promoting ecotourism, and in the 90s, sustainable tourism became a buzzword as well, whatever that really means. Yeah, but it's been promoted. But I think in that immediate area, buggy tours is probably about as much as it goes.
Actually, a question for Jason. I love your project, by the way. I was particularly interested in sort of the transnational commodification of that effort, right, to re-narrativize, right, I think that's the word, Rio. And it seems like with few exceptions, the cities in the examples that they're looking towards all come from the north or from Europe. They're going to, they're bringing in Calatrava as well. So this is not a local, it's not like they're looking to local inspirations, with few exceptions, I think. You mentioned the example of Bogota, which is also a transnational example, but at least it's Latin American. Could you comment a little bit on, did you hear anything, was there any discussion, in your research about the politics or the problematics of always looking outside of Brazil for inspiration? Could you talk about that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, a really good question. try to, there's a part that I'm going to put in there which tries to say that I'm not sure if that's what's always exactly going on. I think that we should remember that there are sort of ways in which, Brazil is a model to other parts of the world, such as participatory budgeting in Porto Alegre, or sort of the more sustainable or community-oriented planning in Curitiba, right? And a lot of mid-century modernism comes out of Brazil as well. So I think there, in terms of how conscious the city is in terms of, I don't see a lot of, within that Bushist discussion itself, talking about North and South issues or only looking at Europe. I think it's almost presented as, it is, I guess the mass narrative is we are arriving on the stage, right? And if the stage is probably Western, right? Some comparisons are made to South Africa, to China. So there is this comparison to the emerging economies, to the BRICS, right? I don't think they're comparing themselves to more underprivileged parts of the developing world. Is true. So there is definitely that dynamics at play. I haven't thought too much about it. I think the people producing these Bushist narratives do like to sort of compare themselves to places that are deemed as successful in the North and the West, right? And I don't know if there's a lot of counter. There's plenty of resistance against local things going on in terms of what's going on with favelas or insane amounts of speculations. I don't know if that's necessarily couched in the North versus South sort of narrative.
Eliminated is a challenge to the dominant white mestizo society. Rudy Carrillo Mansfeld showed quite clearly in a recent article how the codes according to which artists working in the Tigua style create their art are not necessarily the same codes according to which tourists or anthropologists have generally interpreted them. The need to make sales places a great deal of power in the hands of consumers to dictate what the paintings look like and which messages seem to be conveyed. But like street artists in Madison, Tigua painters can challenge that power by creating some messages that their audiences are simply not in a position to understand. The political potential of Tigua paintings is realized most overtly in works that illustrate event actions and interpretations of those who view it, reflect their personality and the nature of their sensibilities. End quote. Clearly, to insist that a piece of street art is meaningless is a meaningful message in itself. But if the artist placing stenciled soldiers in strategic locations around Willie Street has the same attitude as Ferry, then my attempts to assess another's personhood through these soldiers has been focused in entirely the wrong direction. Like Ferry's audience, I may very well be interpreting a reflection of my own personhood. Ultimately, Tigua-style painting is no different. Tourists, promoters, and a variety of economic symbols of code epoxy appear in front of that house instead of some other house. In part, this is a result of the need to conform to consumers' expectations in order to make a sale. As Blanca Muratorio writes, quote, like Gucci and Calvin Klein, both consecrated masters of the market, the indigenous people of the Sierra have mastered the subtleties of the competitive scene and fully understand that they should wear typical clothing and assume appropriate bodily attitudes if they want to legitimize, authenticate, and increase their sales. Tigua painters produce their artworks in that same spirit. But Muratorio goes on to point out that the mere existence of this genre, from which non-indigenous items have been scholars have all tended to view Tigua-style art as illustrative of rural indigenous life in the Ecuadorian Andes. Nor is this perception entirely mistaken, but there are many elements of contemporary indigenous life that one simply does not see in most paintings. For example, this one. There are no machines, there are no modern modes of transportation or any signs of them. Nobody's wearing jeans or a t-shirt here. A practiced eye will note that there are actually quite a few signs of non-indigenous influence on indigenous life. The cinder block house here is one of those aspects. That family is pretty wealthy, and it's, I think, no mistake that the In the manifesto now posted to the website for the Obey campaign, Ferry has this to say, I quote at length. The Obey sticker attempts to stimulate curiosity and bring people to question both the sticker and their relationship with their surroundings, because people are not used to seeing advertisements or propaganda for which the product or motive is not obvious. Frequent and novel encounters with the sticker provoke thought and possible frustration, nevertheless revitalizing the viewer's perception and attention to detail. The sticker has no meaning, but exists only to cause people to react, to contemplate and search for meaning in the sticker. Because Obey has no actual meaning, the various reactions